The silence in Sonny's diner was broken only by the rhythmic tapping of tiny fingers against a worn Formica table. 6-year-old Emma Catherine Sullivan sat frozen in the corner booth, her pale blue dress hanging loose on her small frame, while the man across from her read his newspaper with calculated indifference. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Former Army Special Forces. James Mitchell recognized the pattern immediately. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. His coffee cup trembled in his hands as he watched the little girl's desperate signal. "Please help me," Emma whispered when the man looked away. "He's not my daddy. My real daddy is in heaven." Richard Coleman's cold eyes snapped up from his paper, a practiced smile spreading across his face. "Ready to go, sweetheart? We have a long drive ahead of us." Emma's fingers stopped tapping. Her eyes found James's across the diner, wide with terror and fading hope. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the I-35 rest stop as James Mitchell pulled his weathered pickup truck into the gravel parking lot. At 34, he carried himself with the measured precision of a man who had seen too much and survived when others hadn't. 3 tours in Afghanistan with Special Forces had left him with skills he'd never wanted and memories he couldn't escape. The silver dog tags beneath his faded flannel shirt bore the names of 12 men who didn't make it home. 2 years ago, an IED had torn through his unit outside Kandahar. James had been the only survivor, pulled unconscious from the wreckage while his brothers burned. The guilt followed him like a shadow, whispering that he should have died with them. Now he was driving to Texas for his sister Sarah's funeral, another loss he couldn't prevent, another person he'd failed to protect. Inside Sonny's diner, the air smelled of coffee and apple pie. Margaret O'Brien, a silver-haired woman of 68, wiped down tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been serving truckers and travelers for 40 years. She'd raised 5 children and buried a husband, and her weathered hands could spot trouble from across a room. In the corner booth sat Emma Catherine Sullivan, though she no longer remembered being called by her real name. 6 years old, with golden blonde hair and eyes that had seen too much, she clutched a worn coloring book against her chest. 3 months ago, she'd been living happily with her grandmother after her mother's death from cancer. Catherine Sullivan had been a war photographer who died believing her daughter would be safe with family. But Emma's grandmother had died suddenly, mysteriously, just weeks after refusing to sign custody papers for a man named Richard Coleman. The man who now sat across from Emma, scrolling through his phone with the detached interest of someone checking stock prices rather than caring for a child. Richard appeared successful in his expensive gray suit and polished shoes. To casual observers, he looked like any businessman traveling with his daughter. But Emma knew better. In the 6 weeks since he'd taken her from the group home, she'd learned to read the signs. The way his jaw tightened when she spoke without permission. The cold calculation in his pale blue eyes when he thought no one was watching. The hushed phone conversations about merchandise and delivery schedules. Emma had taught herself Morse code from library books during the lonely months after her mother's death. She'd never imagined she'd need it to save her own life. Her small fingers continued their desperate rhythm against the table, each tap a prayer that someone, anyone, would understand her silent scream for help. James ordered black coffee and positioned himself 3 tables away, his back to the wall, old habits from Afghanistan where sitting with your back exposed could get you killed. He'd learned to read environments, to catalog exits and assess threats within seconds of entering any space. What he saw in Sonny's diner made his trained instincts scream warnings. The little girl hadn't touched her grilled cheese sandwich. It sat untouched on her plate, growing cold while she continued her rhythmic tapping. James counted the intervals. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Over and over. Her small shoulders were rigid with tension, and she never once relaxed into her seat. This wasn't a tired child on a road trip. This was a child in survival mode. The man across from her, Richard he'd heard him called, displayed all the wrong body language for a father. No affectionate touches, no gentle words, no attempts to engage her in conversation. Instead, he treated her like cargo to be monitored. When she shifted in her seat, his eyes snapped to her immediately. When she reached for her water glass, he watched her every movement with the intensity of a predator tracking prey. Margaret O'Brien approached James's table, coffee pot in hand. "More coffee, hun?" Her voice carried the warm drawl of someone who'd spent her entire life in Oklahoma, but her eyes were troubled. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." James kept his voice low. "That little girl over there, how long have they been here?" Margaret's weathered face tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd been running this diner for 23 years, and she'd developed an instinct for reading people. "About an hour now. But here's the thing that's got me worried. I've seen that child before, twice in the past month, each time with a different man." James felt his blood run cold. Different men? First time was about 3 weeks ago. Man claimed to be her uncle, said they were driving to see family in Dallas. Second time, maybe 10 days ago, different fellow entirely. Called himself her grandfather, said they were going to visit her aunt in San Antonio. Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Today, it's her stepfather, and they're supposedly heading to Disney World. But, hon, that child don't look like she's ever been to Disney World in her life. The implications hit James like a physical blow. 3 different men in 3 weeks, all claiming different relationships, all with different destinations. This wasn't custody confusion or family drama. This was something far more sinister. Has she eaten anything during any of these visits? Not much. Picks at her food, mostly just sits there looking scared. And another thing. Margaret glanced around nervously before continuing. None of these men ever acted like family. Too formal, too controlling. Real family has a different energy, you know. These men watch her like guards watching a prisoner. James nodded, his military training kicking into high gear. He'd seen enough human trafficking during his tours to recognize the signs. The child's behavior, the rotating handlers, the carefully maintained distance, it all fit the pattern. When Richard excused himself to use the restroom, Emma's entire body language changed. The rigid tension melted into something approaching normal as she frantically opened her coloring book. But these weren't typical 6-year-old drawings. James could see them clearly from his vantage point, and what he saw made his stomach turn. The first drawing showed stick figures of children behind what looked like bars, with numbers written above each figure. The second depicted a girl who looked remarkably like Emma herself, but with a large X drawn over her mouth. The third was the most disturbing. Men in suits exchanging money over small figures that were clearly meant to represent children. Emma looked up and caught James watching. Instead of the shy smile most children would give a friendly stranger, her eyes were filled with desperate hope. She held up the coloring book slightly, making sure he could see the drawings clearly, then pointed to herself and shook her head violently. James understood. These weren't random childhood sketches. They were documentation, evidence. A 6-year-old's attempt to leave a record of what was happening to her. When Richard returned from the restroom, his demeanor had shifted. He no longer maintained the pretense of patient stepfather. His movements were sharp, purposeful, and his eyes swept the diner with the paranoid intensity of someone who suspected he was being watched. "Emma, finish your sandwich. We need to leave soon." His voice carried an edge that made the child flinch. Emma whispered something so quietly that James had to strain to hear it, but her words chilled him to the bone. He says we're going to Disneyland, but the car is pointing toward Mexico. The pieces began clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The rotating handlers, the careful documentation in her drawings, the movement toward the border. Emma wasn't being taken on vacation. She was being trafficked. Richard's phone buzzed, and he answered it with a curt, "Coleman." James watched as the man's expression grew more agitated. "Yes, the package is ready for delivery. Tonight, as scheduled, no delays. Package, not child, not Emma. Package." Emma had been listening too. When Richard hung up, she looked directly at James with the kind of desperation that transcended age. Her lips moved silently, and James realized she was mouthing words. "Help me." The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the diner floor. Other patrons came and went, truckers grabbing quick meals, families stretching their legs during long drives, elderly couples sharing pie and coffee. Normal people living normal lives, oblivious to the life and death drama unfolding just tables away. Richard checked his watch and began gathering his things. "Time to go, Emma. Say goodbye to your sandwich." Emma's small hands gripped the edge of the table. For a moment, James thought she might resist, might scream or run. Instead, she did something far braver. She looked directly at James, held up her coloring book one final time to make sure he'd seen everything, then slipped a folded piece of paper under her plate. As Richard pulled her toward the door, Emma managed one last desperate whisper that carried across the nearly empty diner. "My real name is Emma Catherine Sullivan. Please don't let him take me to Mexico." The moment James stepped between Richard and the diner exit, the atmosphere in Sonny's diner shifted from tense observation to open confrontation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows as two men faced each other across the worn linoleum floor, with a 6-year-old girl's life hanging in the balance between them. Richard Coleman's carefully constructed facade began to crack under the pressure. His expensive gray suit, which had projected success and respectability just minutes earlier, now seemed like a costume that no longer fit. The polite smile he'd worn when interacting with other customers vanished completely, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator whose prey was slipping away. "Excuse me, sir," James said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command situations. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about your relationship with this child." Emma pressed herself against the booth's vinyl seat, her cornflower blue eyes darting between the two men who now stood as opposing forces in her young life. She had spent weeks learning to read Richard's moods, understanding when to speak and when to remain silent, when to comply and when to resist. But this moment was different. For the first time since her grandmother's death, an adult was actively challenging Richard's authority over her. "I don't know what you're implying," Richard replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But Emma is my legally adopted daughter, and we have a long drive ahead of us. I'd appreciate it if you'd step aside." James didn't move. His military training had taught him to read body language, to identify threats and assess situations with split-second accuracy. Every instinct he possessed was screaming that this man represented danger to the child. "Emma seems reluctant to leave with you. Maybe we should wait for the authorities to sort this out." The word authorities hit Richard like a physical blow. His pale blue eyes flicked toward the windows, checking exit routes and calculating distances. Margaret O'Brien stood behind the counter, her hand resting on the old rotary phone, ready to make another call if needed. The few remaining customers had begun to notice the confrontation, their conversations dying as they sensed the tension building. "You have no right to interfere with my family," Richard said, his voice rising slightly. "Emma, Come here, now." Emma's small body trembled, but she didn't move from the booth. The courage that had sustained her through weeks of captivity seemed to solidify in this moment. "I don't want to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying more weight than any shout could have. James felt his heart clench at the quiet desperation in her voice. This was Afghanistan all over again, watching innocent civilians caught in crossfire, knowing that a wrong move could result in catastrophe. But unlike those distant battlefields, this was a fight he could control, a child he could save. "She's clearly distressed," James observed, addressing Richard but keeping his stance between the man and Emma. No loving parent would force a frightened child to— "Don't you dare lecture me about parenting," Richard snapped, abandoning all pretense of civility. "You don't know anything about our situation. Emma has been through trauma. Her mother died. Her grandmother died. She's confused and scared, but I'm the only family she has left." Margaret stepped forward from behind the counter, her maternal instincts overriding any concern for her own safety. "That's not true, and you know it. I've seen this child 3 times in the past month with 3 different men, all claiming to be family." "You're no more her father than I am." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Richard's face went pale, then flushed with rage as he realized his cover was blown. The other customers in the diner had stopped all pretense of minding their own business and were now openly staring at the confrontation. "That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This woman is obviously confused or lying for attention." Emma chose that moment to speak up, her small voice carrying across the suddenly silent diner. "My real name is Emma Catherine Sullivan. My mommy's name was Catherine, not Karen, like he says. She took pictures for newspapers, and she died because she got sick. My daddy died in a car crash when I was little. This man came after Grandma Rose died, and he's not my family." The simple honesty in her words was devastating to Richard's carefully constructed lies. James watched as the man's composure crumbled completely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath the respectable exterior. "Emma, you're confused," Richard said, but his voice had taken on a threatening edge that made several customers shift uncomfortably. "We've talked about this. Sometimes children get mixed up about things after trauma." "I'm not mixed up," Emma said with startling clarity for a 6-year-old. "I remember everything. I remember the men you talked to who looked at me like I was something to buy. I remember you saying we were going to different places but always driving toward Mexico. I remember you talking on the phone about package delivery and merchandise." James felt the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just kidnapping, it was human trafficking. Emma had been documenting everything with the precision of a trained observer, storing details that would prove crucial to building a case against Richard and his associates. The sound of sirens in the distance made Richard's head snap toward the windows. State Trooper Sarah Martinez's patrol car was approaching fast, its emergency lights painting the diner's interior in alternating red and blue flashes. "You called the police," Richard said, his voice filled with barely controlled fury as he glared at Margaret. "Yes, I did," Margaret replied firmly, "and I'd do it again. That little girl needed someone to stand up for her, and it sure wasn't going to be you." Richard made a sudden move toward Emma, causing James to step forward and block his path. The 2 men faced each other across 3 feet of linoleum, the tension between them crackling like electricity. "You have no idea what you've interfered with," Richard hissed, his mask finally slipping completely. "There are people involved in this operation who don't appreciate complications. You may have just signed all our death warrants." The threat sent chills through everyone present, but James didn't flinch. Years of combat had taught him to face down dangerous men without showing fear. "The only person in danger here is Emma, and I'm not going to let you hurt her." Trooper Martinez burst through the diner's front door, her hand resting on her service weapon as she quickly assessed the situation. Her trained eyes took in the confrontation between James and Richard, Emma's frightened face, and Margaret's protective stance behind the counter. "Oklahoma State Police," Martinez announced. "I need everyone to remain calm while we sort this situation out." Richard immediately shifted tactics, putting on his most charming smile as he approached the trooper. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man has been threatening my daughter and me." "We're just trying to leave for a family vacation, and he's been harassing us." But Martinez had been briefed by Margaret's call and had run preliminary checks on Richard's name during her drive to the diner. The inconsistencies in his identity had already raised red flags in the system. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Martinez said, "and I'd like to speak with the child privately." "Of course," Richard said smoothly, reaching for his wallet. "Though I should mention that Emma has been through significant trauma recently. She sometimes gets confused about details." Emma looked directly at Trooper Martinez with eyes that held far too much knowledge for a 6-year-old. "Ma'am, he's not telling the truth. I can show you pictures I drew of all the bad things I saw, and I know my real name, and my real family's names." The quiet conviction in Emma's voice was more compelling than any adult testimony could have been. Martinez had worked enough domestic cases to recognize the difference between a confused child and one who was being systematically abused. "Emma, would you like to come sit with me while we talk?" Martinez asked gently. Emma nodded and began to slide out of the booth, but Richard moved to block her path. "I don't think that's necessary. Emma can answer any questions while sitting here with me." "Actually, sir, I insist," Martinez said, her tone becoming more authoritative. "Standard procedure in these situations requires separate interviews." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Emma made the decision for everyone. She slipped past Richard when his attention was focused on the trooper and ran directly to James, wrapping her small arms around his waist in a gesture of trust that spoke louder than any words. "Please, don't let him take me," she whispered into James's shirt. "He said tonight was the last stop before we go somewhere I can't come back from." James knelt down to Emma's level, his voice gentle despite the fury building inside him. "You're safe now, sweetheart. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Richard's carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, and everyone in the diner could see it happening. The successful businessman was revealing himself to be nothing more than a sophisticated criminal whose operation was being exposed by the courage of a 6-year-old girl and the intervention of a stranger who had refused to look the other way. As Martinez placed handcuffs on Richard Coleman's wrists, Emma remained close to James, her small hand gripping his fingers like a lifeline. The immediate danger was over, but both James and Emma somehow understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous confrontation. The sun was setting over the Oklahoma plains, casting long shadows across the parking lot where more law enforcement vehicles were beginning to arrive. Inside Sonny's diner, a former soldier and a brave little girl had just taken the first steps in dismantling a criminal network that stretched far beyond anything they could have imagined. The confrontation in Sonny's diner had transformed the sleepy rest stop into a crime scene. State Trooper Sarah Martinez arrived within 20 minutes, her patrol car's flashing lights casting red and blue shadows across the parking lot. At 38, Martinez had seen her share of domestic disputes and custody battles, but something about James Mitchell's call had struck her as different. His military precision in describing the situation, combined with the urgency in his voice, suggested this wasn't a typical family disagreement. Richard Coleman sat in the corner booth, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his demeanor calm and controlled. He'd produced a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be legitimate adoption papers, a birth certificate listing him as Emma's legal guardian, and even a letter from a supposed social worker recommending the placement. To the casual observer, he looked like any successful businessman dealing with an unfortunate misunderstanding. "Officer, I appreciate your prompt response, but this is clearly a case of good intentions gone wrong," Richard said, his voice carrying just the right note of patient understanding. "This gentleman," he gestured toward James, "seems to have misinterpreted my daughter's shy behavior as something sinister. Emma has always been quiet around strangers." James stood near the diner's front counter, his jaw tight with frustration. Every instinct screamed that Richard was lying, but the man's documentation looked convincing. "Trooper Martinez, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I've seen human trafficking operations. This child is exhibiting every classic sign of a trafficking victim." "With all due respect, Mr. Mitchell," Richard interjected smoothly, "military experience doesn't qualify someone to diagnose family dynamics. Emma has been through trauma, losing her mother to cancer, then her grandmother. It's natural for her to be withdrawn and suspicious of new situations." Emma sat pressed against the window in the booth, her small frame seeming to shrink with each passing minute. She hadn't spoken since the authorities arrived, but her eyes never left James's face. When Trooper Martinez approached to speak with her, Emma recoiled visibly. "Emma, sweetheart," Martinez said gently, crouching down to the child's eye level, "can you tell me your full name?" Emma's gaze flicked nervously between Martinez and Richard before she whispered, "Emma Coleman." Richard's smile was triumphant. "You see, she knows who she is, and she knows I'm her legal guardian." But James had caught something in Emma's delivery. The hesitation. The way her eyes had sought permission before speaking. "Ask her about her mother," he said quietly. Martinez nodded. "Emma, can you tell me about your mommy?" This time, Emma's reaction was markedly different. Her eyes filled with tears, and when she spoke, her voice carried genuine emotion. "My mommy's name was Catherine. She took pictures for newspapers. She died because she got sick, and now she lives in heaven with my daddy." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Catherine Coleman, my late wife. Emma sometimes gets confused about the details." "No," Emma said suddenly, louder than she'd spoken all day. "Mommy's name was Catherine Sullivan. She never married you. You came after Grandma Rose died." The contradiction hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Richard's composure cracked slightly, but he recovered quickly. Children often have difficulty with complex family situations. Emma's mother and I weren't formally married, but we lived as husband and wife. The adoption papers reflect the legal reality. Margaret O'Brien, who had been quietly cleaning glasses behind the counter, stepped forward. "Officer, I need to tell you something. I've seen this child before." And 3 times in the past month, each time with a different man. First time was a fellow claimed to be her uncle. Second time, different man said he was her grandfather. Today it's her stepfather. The revelation hit the small group like a thunderbolt. Richard's face went pale, but he maintained his composure. "That's impossible. This woman is obviously confused. I can provide witnesses who will testify to my relationship with Emma." James pulled out his cell phone. "Trooper Martinez, I recorded some of our conversation earlier. Would you like to hear Mr. Coleman discussing package delivery and tonight's schedule?" "I was talking about business shipments," Richard said quickly, but sweat had begun to form on his forehead. "I run an import company. We often discuss deliveries." Martinez's radio crackled to life. She stepped aside to take the call, and when she returned, her entire demeanor had changed. "Mr. Coleman, we've run your name through our system. You have 3 different Social Security numbers on file, and there's an active investigation into missing children cases involving someone matching your description." The mask finally slipped. Richard's practiced charm vanished, replaced by cold calculation. "I want to speak to my lawyer, and I want to leave with my daughter. Now." "Actually, sir, you're not going anywhere." Martinez placed her hand on her service weapon. "Emma, sweetheart, I need you to come with me. We're going to make sure you're safe while we sort this out." Emma looked terrified, but she slid out of the booth and moved toward Martinez. As she passed James, she pressed something small into his palm, the folded piece of paper she'd hidden under her plate. James opened it carefully. In a 6-year-old's careful handwriting were the words, "My real name is Emma Catherine Sullivan. My mommy died 8 months ago. My grandma Rose died 3 months ago. This man is not my family. Please help me find my real family." Below the text was a drawing that made James's blood run cold. It showed a warehouse with multiple small rooms, each containing a child figure. Numbers were written above each room. 27 kids waiting, it said in Emma's innocent handwriting. "Trooper Martinez," James said urgently, "you need to see this." As Martinez examined the note, her radio crackled again. This time, the voice was FBI agent Catherine Torres calling from the Oklahoma City field office. "We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Robert Davidson, also known as Richard Coleman, for interstate trafficking of minors. Suspect is considered extremely dangerous and may be armed." Richard made a sudden movement toward the door, but James was faster. Years of combat training took over as he intercepted Richard's escape attempt, pinning him against the wall with controlled force. "You have no idea what you've done," Richard snarled, his polite facade completely gone. "There are people involved in this that you can't imagine, people with power. This doesn't end with arresting me." Emma, who had been silent during the struggle, suddenly spoke up with startling clarity. "He has pictures on his phone, pictures of all the other children, and he talks to a judge, Judge Morrison. He says the judge makes sure nobody gets in trouble." The implications of her words sent shockwaves through the small group. A trafficking ring involving a federal judge explained how Richard had maintained such convincing documentation and avoided detection for so long. As Martinez handcuffed Richard, her phone buzzed with an incoming text message. "Package delayed. Buyers are asking questions. Fix this or we lose the entire Mexican operation." The text had been meant for Richard's phone, but in the confusion it had been sent to the wrong number. The message confirmed what everyone now realized. Emma wasn't just the victim of a single predator. She was a commodity in a vast network that stretched across state lines and international borders. Agent Torres's voice came through the radio again. "We're tracking multiple vehicles converging on your location. This appears to be a coordinated pickup operation. You need backup immediately." Outside Sonny's diner, the peaceful Oklahoma evening was about to become a battlefield in the fight to save Emma Catherine Sullivan and possibly dozens of other children just like her. The warehouse 20 miles outside of town sat like a cancer against the Oklahoma landscape, its corrugated metal walls reflecting the dying light of sunset. FBI agent Catherine Torres had coordinated the multi-agency response with military precision, but as they approached the sprawling complex of buildings, the scope of the operation became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a holding facility, it was a distribution center for human cargo. James crouched behind an abandoned delivery truck, his special forces training taking over as he surveyed the scene. Agent Torres had reluctantly agreed to let him participate after he'd provided crucial intelligence from Emma's drawings and his observations of Richard's behavior patterns. The little girl's artwork had proved unnervingly accurate. The warehouse layout matched her crayon sketches down to the smallest details. "I count at least 8 vehicles in the compound," James whispered into his radio. 3 black SUVs, 2 panel vans, and what looks like a refrigerated truck. That's not normal for an abandoned facility. Through his binoculars, Torres could see movement inside the buildings. Heat signatures from the SWAT team's thermal imaging revealed multiple adults and what appeared to be smaller figures, children, in various rooms throughout the complex. The refrigerated truck made her stomach turn. In trafficking operations, such vehicles were often used for the worst-case scenarios. Inside the main building, Derek Morrison, the corrupt federal judge who had been Richard's partner, paced nervously among the cages. 27 children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, sat in small holding rooms that had been constructed inside the warehouse. Each child wore a numbered bracelet, and their paperwork was filed with the same cold efficiency as livestock records. Morrison's phone rang incessantly. Richard's arrest had sent shockwaves through the network, and buyers from Mexico to Canada were demanding answers. A shipment worth over $2 million in human trafficking was now in jeopardy, and the people who had invested in this operation didn't accept losses quietly. "We moved the merchandise tonight," Morrison told his lieutenant, a scarred man named Vincent Cruz, who handled the more violent aspects of their business. "All of it. If the feds are onto us, we need to clean house completely." Emma's information had been devastating to their operation. She had memorized license plates, overheard phone conversations, and even identified several key players in the network. Worse still, she had documented everything in her innocent drawings, creating a paper trail that could destroy them all. Back at the rest stop, Emma sat in the passenger seat of Agent Torres's vehicle, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her mother. Despite her young age, she understood the gravity of what was happening. The other children she had drawn were real, and they were in danger because she had finally found the courage to ask for help. "The man with the scary eyes," Emma told Torres. "He said they were going to take everyone to a boat tonight. He said once they get on the boat, nobody ever comes home." Torres felt her heart sink. International waters meant jurisdiction issues, diplomatic complications, and children disappearing forever into a global network that authorities struggled to penetrate. Time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. The tactical team moved into position as darkness fell across the Oklahoma plains. James found himself partnered with SWAT Commander Rodriguez, a veteran of similar operations who had seen too many cases end badly when children were involved. Both men understood that the next hour would determine whether 27 families would be reunited or whether they would spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their children. "Remember," Rodriguez whispered as they approached the perimeter fence, "these people have nothing to lose now. They'll fight like cornered animals, and they won't hesitate to use the children as shields." Inside the warehouse, alarms began blaring. Morrison's security system had detected the approaching law enforcement, and the facility erupted into controlled chaos. Vincent Cruz began moving children toward a loading dock where 3 vehicles waited with engines running. The escape plan was simple but effective. Scatter the children among multiple vehicles heading in different directions, making it impossible for authorities to intercept them all. James watched through night vision goggles as small figures were herded like cattle toward the waiting trucks. Even from a distance, he could see their terror, the way they clung to each other for comfort in a nightmare that no child should ever experience. One little girl, maybe 5 years old, stumbled and fell. When Cruz roughly yanked her to her feet, James felt something snap inside him. "I'm going in," he told Rodriguez through his radio. "Those children are about to be loaded into vehicles, and once they're mobile, we'll lose them forever." "Negative, Mitchell. Wait for the coordinated assault." But James was already moving. Years of watching Afghan children suffer while bound by rules of engagement and political considerations had left him with a simple philosophy. Sometimes, you had to choose between following orders and saving lives. He chose the children. The warehouse's side entrance was poorly guarded, and James slipped inside with the silent efficiency that had made him one of Special Forces' most effective operatives. The interior was a maze of makeshift rooms and holding areas, but Emma's drawings had provided him with a mental map that proved invaluable. In the first room he found, 3 children sat huddled together on a thin mattress. They couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, and their eyes held the hollow look of kids who had stopped believing in rescue. James knelt down to their level, speaking in the gentle voice he'd once used with Afghan children caught in war zones. "I'm here to take you home," he whispered. "But I need you to be very quiet and very brave. Can you do that for me?" The children nodded, their faces flickering between hope and terror. James guided them toward the exit he'd entered through, but the sound of approaching footsteps forced him to change course. Vincent Cruz was conducting a sweep of the facility, looking for the breach in security that his instincts told him had occurred. James found himself trapped in a narrow corridor with 3 frightened children, armed men searching for them, and no clear escape route. Outside, he could hear the tactical team beginning their assault. But they were still minutes away from reaching this part of the building. Minutes that might as well be hours when children's lives hung in the balance. The sound of a child crying echoed through the warehouse. Not from the children with James, but from somewhere deeper in the facility. It was a sound of pure terror, the kind that cut through trained combat veterans like a knife. Someone was hurting one of the kids, and James knew he couldn't wait for backup any longer. He handed his radio to the oldest of the 3 children he'd found. "When I tell you, press this button and say, 'Eagle needs backup in the East Corridor.' Can you remember that?" The boy, maybe 7 years old, nodded solemnly. "Eagle needs backup in the East Corridor." "Good boy. Now stay here and don't move until someone in a police uniform comes for you." James moved deeper into the warehouse, following the sounds of distress. What he found in the loading dock area would haunt him for the rest of his life and fuel his determination to ensure that every single person involved in this nightmare faced justice. The loading dock area opened up into a scene that would forever scar James's memory. 24 children sat in metal cages barely large enough for animal transport, their small hands gripping the bars as tears streamed down their faces. The youngest couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They wore numbered tags around their wrists like inventory in a warehouse, and their eyes held the hollow look of souls who had given up hope. Vincent Cruz stood over a small boy who couldn't have been older than 5, his massive hand wrapped around the child's throat. "You keep crying, and I'll give you something to really cry about," he snarled. The boy's face was turning blue, his tiny hands clawing helplessly at Cruz's grip. James didn't hesitate. Years of combat training took over as he moved with lethal silence across the concrete floor. He struck Cruz in the kidney with devastating precision, causing the man to release the child and spin around with a roar of pain and rage. "Who the hell are you?" Cruz demanded, pulling a pistol from his waistband. "Someone who doesn't hurt children," James replied coldly, his eyes never leaving Cruz's weapon. The confrontation erupted into violence as Cruz fired wildly in James's direction. The children screamed in terror as bullets ricocheted off metal cages and concrete walls. James dove behind a stack of wooden crates, his mind calculating angles and escape routes, while the sounds of terrified sobbing filled the air. But the worst was yet to come. Judge Morrison appeared from the shadows, dragging a small girl with curly blonde hair who looked remarkably like Emma. "Drop your weapon and surrender, or I start executing children," Morrison shouted, pressing a gun to the little girl's temple. The child, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, looked directly at James with the kind of trust that children reserve for adults they believe can save them. "Please, mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "I want to go home to my mommy." James felt something break inside his chest. This was Afghanistan all over again, watching innocent children caught in the crossfire of adult evil, knowing that any wrong move could result in their deaths. The little girl in Morrison's grasp could have been Emma, could have been his own niece, could have been any of the children he'd failed to save overseas. "Let her go," James said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Your fight is with me, not with these kids." Morrison laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. "My fight is with my profit margins. Do you have any idea how much money you've cost me tonight? Each of these children represents a $50,000 investment. Some of the older ones are worth twice that to the right buyers." The casual way Morrison discussed the children as commodities sent waves of nausea through James. These weren't numbers on a balance sheet. They were someone's sons and daughters, children who should have been safe in their beds, reading bedtime stories and dreaming of birthday parties. Cruz had recovered from James's initial attack and was positioning himself for a clear shot. But as he raised his weapon, the boy he'd been choking, the same child whose near strangulation had triggered James's intervention, picked up a loose piece of concrete and hurled it with surprising accuracy. The projectile struck Cruz in the head, causing him to stagger and fire wide. The distraction gave James the opening he needed. He launched himself across the space between them, tackling Cruz to the ground as the sound of splintering wood echoed through the warehouse. The tactical team had finally breached the main entrance, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like swords of hope. But Morrison still held the little girl, and his finger was tightening on the trigger. "I'll kill her!" he screamed at the approaching SWAT officers. "I'll kill all of them before I let you take them." James found himself in an impossible position. He was close enough to potentially disarm Morrison, but any sudden movement might cause the judge to reflexively pull the trigger. The little girl was crying now, calling for her mother in a voice that cut through every adult heart in the building. "What's your name, sweetheart?" James asked gently, trying to establish a connection that might help calm both the child and her captor. "Amy Chen," she whispered. "I'm 6 years old, and I live in Dallas with my mommy and daddy." The name hit James like a physical blow. Amy Chen, the same name as his niece, the child his sister had been driving to protect when she died in that car accident. The cosmic cruelty of the situation wasn't lost on him. He'd failed to save his sister, failed to save his unit in Afghanistan, and now he was watching another Amy face death while he stood helpless. But Amy Chen wasn't helpless. Despite her terror, she was watching James with the kind of intensity that suggested she understood he was trying to help her. When Morrison's attention shifted momentarily to the approaching tactical team, Amy did something that displayed courage far beyond her 6 years. She bit Morrison's hand with every ounce of strength in her small body. Morrison screamed and reflexively released his grip, but his finger was already squeezing the trigger. The gunshot seemed to echo forever in the confined space, and for one heart-stopping moment, James thought he'd failed again, thought he'd watched another child die while he stood powerless to prevent it. But Amy was still standing. Morrison's reflexive jerk had thrown off his aim, and the bullet had buried itself harmlessly in the concrete wall. The little girl ran straight to James, who caught her in his arms as SWAT officers swarmed Morrison. The judge wasn't finished, though. Even as officers surrounded him, he pulled a second weapon, a backup pistol hidden in an ankle holster. "If I'm going down, I'm taking some of them with me," he snarled, swinging the weapon toward the cages filled with terrified children. James didn't think. He couldn't afford to think. He shoved Amy behind him and threw himself between Morrison and the children, feeling the impact of the bullet tear through his shoulder and spin him around. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but he remained standing, his body forming a human shield between the monster and his intended victims. SWAT officers opened fire simultaneously, and Judge Derek Morrison crumpled to the concrete floor, his reign of terror finally ended. But the damage had been done. James collapsed next to the cages, his blood pooling on the warehouse floor as 24 children watched the man who had tried to save them fighting for his own life. Amy Chen, the 6-year-old girl who had shown such incredible courage, knelt beside James and took his hand. "Don't leave us, mister," she whispered. "We still need you." As consciousness began to fade, James could hear sirens approaching, could see the tactical team working frantically to free the caged children. But his last clear thought before the darkness took him was a simple prayer: that Emma Catherine Sullivan and Amy Chen and all the other children would find their way home, and that someone braver than him would be there to protect them when they did. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of keys unlocking cages and children crying for their mothers. The nightmare was over, but the healing would take much longer. The Oklahoma University Medical Center's trauma bay buzzed with controlled chaos as James Mitchell fought for his life on the operating table. The bullet had shattered his shoulder blade and nicked an artery, causing massive blood loss that left him clinging to consciousness. Outside the operating room, FBI agent Catherine Torres paced the sterile hallway, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated the largest child trafficking investigation in the state's history. But it was what Torres discovered in her investigation that would shatter everyone's understanding of the case. The evidence recovered from the warehouse wasn't just about Richard Coleman's trafficking ring. It was the missing piece of a puzzle that had haunted her for 3 years. In Judge Morrison's personal safe, investigators found a collection of photographs that made seasoned law enforcement officers physically sick. Among them were pictures of Emma's mother, Catherine Sullivan, taken without her knowledge during the months before her death. But these weren't casual surveillance photos. They were detailed documentation of her daily routines, her medical appointments, her meetings with sources for her investigative journalism work. Catherine Sullivan hadn't died of natural causes from cancer. She had been systematically poisoned with heavy metals over a 6-month period, her symptoms carefully designed to mimic aggressive cancer. The medical records Morrison kept showed the precise dosage calculations, the timing of each administration, and the projected timeline for her death. The horrifying truth emerged as Torres dug deeper into the recovered files. Catherine had been investigating the same trafficking network that had ultimately claimed her daughter. Her work as a war photographer had brought her into contact with international adoption agencies that were fronts for child trafficking operations. She had been documenting evidence, building a case, preparing to expose the network when they discovered her investigation. Emma's grandmother, Rose Sullivan, had died the same way. When she refused to sign custody papers giving Richard Coleman legal guardianship of Emma, she too had been slowly poisoned. The estate documents in Morrison's safe showed that Emma's trust fund, worth over $2 million, had been the ultimate prize. They hadn't just been trafficking her body, they had been stealing her entire inheritance. But the most devastating revelation came when Torres opened Catherine's final letter, sealed and never sent, found hidden in Emma's stuffed rabbit. The letter was addressed to Torres herself, though they had never met. "Agent Torres," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am dead, and my daughter Emma is in terrible danger. I have been investigating a trafficking network that reaches into the highest levels of government. Federal Judge Derek Morrison is not just corrupt, he is the architect of an operation that has stolen and sold over 200 children in the past 5 years. I have documented evidence of his involvement, but I know they are watching me. I fear I will not live to see justice done." The letter went on to detail Catherine's discovery that her husband, Emma's father, had also been murdered 3 years earlier. His car accident hadn't been accidental. He had been a federal prosecutor working on cases involving missing children, and he had gotten too close to the truth about Morrison's network. Torres felt physically ill as she read the final paragraph. "I am hiding evidence in Emma's belongings that will prove everything. If something happens to me, Please know that I died trying to protect not just my daughter, but all the children who have suffered at the hands of these monsters. Emma is stronger than she appears and smarter than anyone realizes. Trust her. She sees everything, remembers everything, and she will be the key to bringing them down." The evidence Catherine had hidden was extensive and damning. Morrison's network hadn't just been trafficking children locally. They had been part of an international operation that moved children from the United States to buyers in Mexico, Central America, and Eastern Europe. The financial records showed transactions totaling over $50 million over 3 years. Emma's drawings, which everyone had assumed were the frightened sketches of a traumatized child, were actually precise documentation of everything she had witnessed. Her 6-year-old mind had processed and recorded details that would prove crucial to prosecuting the remaining members of the network. She had memorized license plates, faces, conversations, and locations with photographic accuracy. As Torres studied Emma's artwork more carefully, she realized the little girl had been conducting her own investigation. She had deliberately gotten herself placed in situations where she could observe and document the trafficking operation. Her apparent compliance with Richard Coleman hadn't been submission. It had been strategy. The most shocking discovery came when Torres interviewed Emma more thoroughly. The 6-year-old revealed that she had been in contact with other children in the network, sharing information and coordinating their own survival strategies. She had taught several younger children simple code words and signals that might help them if they were ever separated. "I knew my mommy was trying to stop the bad men," Emma told Torres with a maturity that belied her age. "Before she got sick, she told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should watch and remember everything, because someday someone would need to know the truth." Emma had been carrying the weight of her mother's investigation for months, understanding far more about her situation than any child should ever have to. She had known that Richard wasn't really adopting her. He was preparing to sell her. She had known that her mother and grandmother had been murdered. And she had known that she was probably going to die unless she found someone brave enough to help her. But perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation was that Emma had recognized James as military from the moment she saw him in the diner. She had deliberately chosen to signal to him because she remembered her mother saying that soldiers were trained to protect people, especially children. "I knew he was a good soldier because he had sad eyes like Daddy did when he came home from court," Emma explained to Torres. "Mommy said the good soldiers are the ones who get sad when bad things happen to kids." The scope of Morrison's network was staggering. Over the 3 years he had been operating, he had processed 200 children through various schemes: fake adoptions, fraudulent foster placements, and outright kidnapping. Most of these children came from vulnerable populations: orphans, children of undocumented immigrants, kids in the foster system who had no family advocating for them. The financial investigation revealed that Morrison had used his position as a federal judge to facilitate the legal aspects of the trafficking operation. He had sealed court records, expedited adoption proceedings, and dismissed child welfare cases that might have exposed the network. His judicial salary was supplemented by over $3 million in trafficking proceeds. As James slowly awakened in his hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding him, the first face he saw was Emma's. She was sitting in a chair beside his bed, coloring quietly in a new book. When she realized he was conscious, she looked up with a smile that held both innocence and wisdom. "I drew you a picture," she said softly, holding up her latest artwork. This drawing was different from the others. It showed a soldier and a little girl standing together under a bright sun, surrounded by other children who were laughing and playing freely. "We won, didn't we?" James whispered through his pain medication haze. Emma nodded solemnly. "Mommy would be proud of both of us. We stopped the bad men from hurting any more kids." But as Torres watched the tender moment between the wounded soldier and the brave little girl, she knew that their victory had come at a terrible cost. Emma had lost her entire family. James carried the physical and emotional scars of his heroism, and 200 other families were still searching for children who might never come home. The truth had finally been revealed, but justice was just beginning. 6 months after the warehouse raid, the federal courthouse in Oklahoma City had become the epicenter of the largest human trafficking prosecution in U.S. history. The trial of United States Fras. Morrison and Associates had drawn national media attention, with families of rescued children traveling from across the country to witness justice being served. James Mitchell sat in the front row of the gallery, his left arm still in a sling from his shoulder reconstruction surgery, watching as Emma Catherine Sullivan prepared to give the testimony that would seal the fate of the remaining trafficking network members. The little girl who had once tapped out SOS signals in a roadside diner now stood confidently at the witness stand, her blonde hair neatly braided and wearing a blue dress that her new guardian had helped her pick out. At 6 years old, Emma was the youngest witness ever to testify in a federal trafficking case, but her testimony would prove to be the most devastating evidence presented against the defendants. FBI agent Catherine Torres had spent months working with child psychologists to prepare Emma for this moment. The little girl had insisted on testifying, understanding with remarkable maturity that her words could help bring home the children who were still missing. Her mother's hidden evidence had provided the documentary proof, but Emma's first-hand account would humanize the horror for the jury. "Emma," the prosecutor began gently, "can you tell us about the drawings you made while you were with Mr. Coleman?" Emma's voice was clear and steady as she explained her artwork. "I drew pictures of all the children I saw because Mommy taught me that sometimes grown-ups don't believe kids unless they have proof. I wanted to make sure everyone would know about the other kids if something happened to me." The courtroom fell silent as Emma described her systematic documentation of the trafficking operation. She had memorized faces, license plates, and conversations with the precision of a trained investigator. Her testimony revealed that she had understood far more about her situation than anyone had realized. "The man with the scary eyes, that's what I called Mr. Morrison, he told Mr. Richard that I was worth extra money because I was smart and pretty," Emma continued, her matter-of-fact delivery making the grotesque reality even more chilling. "He said the people in Mexico liked smart children because they could work longer without getting tired." James felt his jaw clench as he listened to Emma's testimony. This 6-year-old child had endured horrors that would break most adults, yet she spoke with a courage that humbled everyone in the courtroom. Her resilience was both inspiring and heartbreaking. No child should ever have to develop such strength. The defense attorneys had objected strenuously to allowing Emma to testify, arguing that a 6-year-old's testimony was unreliable. But when the prosecution presented Emma's drawings alongside the physical evidence found at the warehouse, the correlation was undeniable. Every detail she had documented had proven accurate, from the layout of the holding facility to the identities of the people involved. Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist who had worked with Emma, testified about the little girl's exceptional memory and intelligence. "Emma demonstrates what we call hypervigilance, a survival mechanism common in trauma victims where they become extraordinarily aware of their surroundings. In her case, this hypervigilance, combined with her natural intelligence, made her an inadvertent but highly effective witness to the crimes committed against her and other children." The prosecution presented evidence that the trafficking network had operated with shocking sophistication. Judge Morrison had used his judicial position to create a pipeline of vulnerable children, targeting orphans and children in foster care who had significant inheritance money or trust funds. The financial records showed that the network had generated over $75 million in profits over 5 years. Margaret O'Brien, the diner owner who had first helped James identify the trafficking situation, testified about the 3 different men she had seen with Emma over the course of a month. Her testimony corroborated Emma's account and established the pattern of rotating handlers that was characteristic of professional trafficking operations. "I've been serving folks at that diner for 23 years, Margaret told the jury, her Oklahoma drawl thick with emotion. "I know what families look like, and those men weren't family. They watched that little girl like she was cargo they were responsible for delivering." The most emotional moment of the trial came when Amy Chen, the 6-year-old girl James had saved in the warehouse, testified via closed-circuit television. She described the conditions in the holding facility and the other children who had been imprisoned with her. Her testimony was brief but devastating, providing corroboration for Emma's more detailed account. James took the stand on the fourth day of the trial, describing his military background and his training in recognizing human trafficking situations. His testimony focused on the behavioral indicators he had observed in both Emma and Richard Coleman, providing expert context for Emma's distress signals. "In Afghanistan, we learned to recognize when children were in danger," James testified. "Children in combat zones develop specific behaviors: hypervigilance, reluctance to speak, constant assessment of exits and threats. Emma displayed all of these behaviors, plus she was actively signaling for help using Morse code. In my professional opinion, she was operating in pure survival mode." The defense attempted to discredit James's testimony by focusing on his PTSD diagnosis, suggesting that his mental health issues had caused him to misinterpret a normal family situation. But the physical evidence in Emma's testimony made their argument seem desperate and cruel. The trial's turning point came when prosecutors revealed the contents of Catherine Sullivan's hidden investigation. The jury listened in stunned silence as Agent Torres read excerpts from Catherine's final letter, describing her discovery of the trafficking network and her systematic poisoning by Morrison's associates. "I am dying," Catherine had written, "but I pray that my death will not be in vain. Emma carries within her memory the evidence needed to destroy this network. She is braver and stronger than any child should have to be, but she is also the key to saving hundreds of other children." The revelation that both Emma's parents and her grandmother had been murdered to gain access to her trust fund sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The gallery erupted in gasps and muffled sobs as the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. During closing arguments, the prosecutor painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years, protected by judicial corruption and enabled by a system that too often failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. "Emma Catherine Sullivan is not just a survivor," the prosecutor told the jury. "She is a hero." At 6 years old, she had the courage to document evidence, signal for help, and ultimately testify in this courtroom to ensure that justice is served not just for herself but for every child who has suffered at the hands of this network. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt and the reliability of child testimony, but their case had been systematically destroyed by the mountain of corroborating evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against all defendants. As the verdicts were read, James watched Emma's face carefully. The little girl sat quietly, her small hands folded in her lap, showing none of the satisfaction or relief that adults might feel at such a moment. Instead, she looked thoughtful, as if processing the weight of what had just occurred. After the trial, James found Emma sitting alone in the courthouse cafeteria, slowly eating a chocolate chip cookie. He sat down beside her, and for several minutes they sat in comfortable silence. "Are you okay?" James asked finally. Emma looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "I miss my mommy and daddy," she said simply. "But I think they would be proud that we helped the other kids." James felt tears welling up in his eyes. This remarkable little girl had endured unimaginable trauma, yet her primary concern remained for other children who were still suffering. Her compassion and resilience had humbled everyone who met her. "What happens now?" Emma asked. James smiled and took her small hand in his. "Now we go home, and we start building the kind of life your parents would have wanted for you." Emma smiled back, and for the first time since he had met her, James saw genuine happiness in her eyes. The long journey toward healing was just beginning, but they would face it together. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the small house on Maple Street that James and Emma now called home. The walls were decorated with Emma's artwork, but these new drawings showed children playing in parks, families having picnics, and soldiers coming home to happy reunions. The nightmares had gradually faded, replaced by the simple joys of a 7-year-old discovering what normal childhood could feel like. James stood in the kitchen making pancakes, a Saturday morning tradition they had established. Emma sat at the breakfast table working on her homework, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she practiced writing cursive letters. The domestic tranquility was something neither of them had dared hope for during those dark days in the warehouse. "Daddy James," Emma said, looking up from her workbook, "Mrs. Peterson wants me to write about my hero for the school essay contest." "Can I write about you?" James felt his throat tighten with emotion. In the year since the trial, Emma had slowly begun calling him Daddy James, a title that meant more to him than any military commendation he had ever received. The adoption papers had been finalized 6 months ago, making their bond official in the eyes of the law, though their connection had been forged in circumstances far more profound than legal documents. "You can write about whoever you want, sweetheart," James replied, flipping a pancake with perhaps more concentration than necessary to hide his emotional reaction. "But you know you're my hero too, right?" Emma giggled, the sound that had become James's favorite music. "I'm just a kid. Heroes are supposed to be grown-ups." "Heroes come in all sizes," James said, sitting down beside her at the table. "Sometimes the smallest people show the biggest courage." The transformation in both of their lives had been remarkable. James had found purpose beyond his military service, establishing the Catherine Sullivan Foundation for Missing Children with Emma's inheritance money. The foundation provided resources for families of trafficking victims and trained law enforcement agencies in recognizing signs of child exploitation. Emma had insisted that her mother's name be on the foundation, wanting to honor Catherine's unfinished investigation that had ultimately brought down the trafficking network. Emma had thrived in her new school, though she still saw Dr. Chen, the child psychologist, once a week. Her teachers marveled at her intelligence and maturity, but they also noted her protective instincts toward younger children and her uncanny ability to spot when someone was troubled or afraid. "We have visitors coming today," James reminded Emma as they ate their pancakes. "Remember I told you about the Chen family?" Emma's face lit up with genuine excitement. Amy Chen, the little girl James had saved in the warehouse, had become Emma's closest friend despite living in Dallas. The two girls had bonded over their shared experience and had maintained a correspondence that amazed both families with its depth and wisdom. "Is Amy bringing her new sister?" Emma asked. The Chen family had recently adopted another child from the foster system, a 5-year-old girl whose parents had died in a car accident. "Yes, and she's very excited to meet you." Amy's told her all about her brave friend Emma who helped catch the bad men. The doorbell rang, and Emma jumped up with the enthusiasm typical of a 7-year-old expecting friends. But when she opened the door, she found more than just the Chen family waiting on their front porch. Margaret O'Brien stood there with an apple pie in her hands, her weathered face beaming with grandmotherly affection. Behind her were FBI agent Torres and her own daughter, whom she had successfully recovered from the trafficking network. Trooper Sarah Martinez had driven down from Oklahoma City with her husband and teenage son. Even Dr. Chen had made the trip from Oklahoma City to join what had become an impromptu reunion. "Surprise!" Margaret called out, her Oklahoma drawl thick with emotion. We couldn't let this anniversary pass without celebrating together. James realized with a start that it had been exactly 1 year since that afternoon in Sonny's diner, when a 6-year-old girl's courage had changed all their lives. In the chaos of building their new life together, he had lost track of the date's significance. But clearly, the others had not. Emma hugged each visitor with the unself-conscious affection of a child who had learned to trust again. As the group gathered in James's small living room, the conversation naturally turned to the impact their actions had had over the past year. Agent Torres provided an update on the ongoing investigation. Thanks to Emma's testimony and the evidence her mother gathered, we've rescued 127 additional children and dismantled trafficking networks in 6 states. The financial assets we seized are funding victim services programs across the country. Margaret had established a training program for restaurant and service industry workers to recognize signs of trafficking. Emma's story is being taught in diners and truck stops from here to California, she explained. We're calling it the Emma Protocol, simple signs that ordinary folks can watch for to help kids in danger. Amy Chen, now 7 years old and as articulate as Emma, stood up to address the group with the seriousness of a much older child. Emma taught me that being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. When I was in that scary place, I remembered how she never gave up, and it helped me stay strong. The afternoon evolved into a celebration of survival and healing. Emma showed her artwork to the group, explaining how her drawings had changed from documenting horror to capturing hope. James grilled hamburgers in the backyard while the children played on the swing set he had installed, the first one Emma had ever owned. As evening approached and their guests prepared to leave, Emma made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I want to tell you all something important," she said, her 7-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone much older. "I've been thinking about what happened to us, and I realized something. The bad men thought they could win because they thought nobody would care enough to help kids they didn't know. But they were wrong. All of you cared. All of you helped. And that's why we won." Agent Torres wiped tears from her eyes as she knelt down to Emma's level. "You're absolutely right, sweetie. Evil only wins when good people choose not to act." Margaret gathered Emma into one of her famous grandmother hugs. "You changed all our lives, little one. You reminded us what's really important in this world." As the visitors departed, James and Emma cleaned up the dishes together, a comfortable routine they had developed. Emma was unusually quiet as they worked, and James could tell she was processing the emotions of the day. "Daddy James," Emma said finally, "do you think my real mommy and daddy know that I'm okay now?" James set down the dish he was drying and knelt beside Emma, taking her small hands in his. "I think they know, sweetheart, and I think they're incredibly proud of the brave, kind, amazing little girl you've become." Emma smiled, the radiant expression that had become James's greatest treasure. "I think they sent you to save me, like a guardian angel, but one who knows how to make really good pancakes." James laughed, pulling Emma into a hug that conveyed all the love and protection he would spend the rest of his life providing. "I think they sent you to save me too, Emma. You gave me a reason to believe in hope again." As they finished their evening routine and James tucked Emma into her bed, a real bed in her own room decorated with unicorns and rainbows, she made one final observation that would stay with him forever. "You know what I learned, Daddy James? Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things. If the bad men hadn't taken me, I never would have met you, and Amy never would have met her new family. And Agent Torres never would have found her daughter. Maybe God lets bad things happen so that good people can show how much love they have inside them." James kissed Emma's forehead, marveling at the wisdom contained in such a small person. "You might be right about that, sweetheart. Sleep tight." As he turned off her bedroom light, Emma called out one last time, Daddy James, tomorrow can we go visit the other kids at the foundation? I want to tell them that everything's going to be okay. Of course we can, James replied. We'll tell them together. Walking downstairs to his own room, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A chance stop at a roadside diner had led to the rescue of over 150 children, the destruction of a massive criminal network, and the creation of a family neither he nor Emma had expected to find. On his nightstand sat a framed photograph of Emma presenting him with an award from the National Center for Missing Children. In the picture, she was standing on her tiptoes to place a medal around his neck, her face glowing with pride. But James knew the truth. Emma was the real hero of their story. She had saved not only herself and countless other children, but she had also saved a broken soldier who had lost his way. Outside their small house on Maple Street, the Oklahoma night was peaceful and quiet. Inside, a former Special Forces operative and a 7-year-old survivor slept soundly, both dreaming of the bright future they would build together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to help other children find their way home. But tonight, they were simply a father and daughter who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen to create something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The story that had begun with a desperate SOS signal in a roadside diner had evolved into something far greater, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose to stand up for those who cannot protect themselves. In her sleep, Emma smiled, perhaps dreaming of her parents watching over her from heaven, knowing their little girl was finally, truly safe. Message for American seniors. 200 words. This story reminds us that heroism isn't about age or size. It's about choosing to act when someone needs help. Emma Catherine Sullivan, at just 6 years old, showed more courage than most adults ever will. But the real power came from ordinary people like Margaret, the diner owner, and James, a struggling veteran who chose to get involved instead of looking the other way. As grandparents and experienced adults, we've lived long enough to recognize that evil thrives when good people stay silent. In our communities today, children still need advocates, whether it's noticing a troubled neighbor kid, supporting local foster families, or simply being the adult who pays attention when something doesn't feel right. Emma's story proves that one person's willingness to speak up can save countless lives. We may not be able to stop international trafficking rings, but we can be the voice for a child who has no one else. Our wisdom, experience, and moral courage are exactly what vulnerable children need most. Sometimes the smallest gesture, a kind word, a watchful eye, a willingness to get involved, can change everything. Every child deserves someone who cares enough to notice when they're in trouble. Discussion questions. Have you ever encountered a situation where you felt something wasn't right with a child but weren't sure whether to intervene? What held you back or motivated you to act? What role do you think grandparents and senior community members should play in protecting children in our neighborhoods today? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories might inspire others to be more vigilant protectors of the children in our communities.